Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is, why wasn't Cleopatra famous for her beauty? You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why wasn't Cleopatra famous for her beauty? Have you ever noticed how certain people become so surrounded by legend that the truth almost disappears beneath centuries of imagination? Few names in history carry that kind of mystery more completely than Cleopatra. For many people today, simply hearing her name brings to mind an image of extraordinary beauty. Paintings, films, novels, and television dramas have repeated the same idea for generations. A queen with flawless features, captivating eyes, and a beauty so powerful that even the greatest leaders of Rome supposedly lost all reason in her presence. It is a story that feels almost timeless. Yet history, as it often does, whispers something far more interesting. When we begin looking beyond the legends and return to the surviving evidence left behind by ancient writers, coins, inscriptions, and archaeology, a different woman slowly begins to appear. She was certainly remarkable. She fascinated almost everyone who met her. She changed the direction of Mediterranean history. She influenced the fate of kingdoms and empires. But surprisingly, very few of the people who actually knew her described her as the most beautiful woman in the world. In fact, several ancient writers seemed almost uninterested in discussing her physical appearance at all. Instead, they kept returning to something else. Her voice, her intelligence, her confidence, her education, her ability to speak with almost anyone in their own language, her extraordinary talent for making every conversation unforgettable. As the centuries passed, those quieter descriptions gradually faded behind stories that became larger, brighter, and far more dramatic. Tonight, we gently travel back through more than 2,000 years of history to discover how that transformation happened. Our journey begins not with Cleopatra herself, but with the world waiting to receive her. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean during the 1st century before the Common Era. The air carries the scent of salt, drifting across busy harbors. Merchant ships arrive from Greece, Arabia, Nubia, and distant India. Markets overflow with papyrus, spices, perfumes, fine linen, ivory, precious stones, and carefully rolled manuscripts copied by patient scribes. Alexandria, Cleopatra's home, is one of the greatest cities on earth. Its famous lighthouse rises above the coastline like a permanent star guiding ships safely towards the harbor. Its library has become legendary even during its own lifetime. Scholars from every corner of the known world gather here to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, geography, literature, and languages. Walking through the city would have been unlike visiting almost anywhere else. Greek philosophy mixed with Egyptian traditions. Roman diplomats crossed paths with African merchants. Jewish communities lived alongside Egyptians, Greeks, Syrians, and many others. Different languages floated through crowded streets from sunrise until long after sunset. This was not a quiet kingdom isolated from the wider world. It was one of history's greatest crossroads. Long before Cleopatra became queen, her ancestors had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. Although they ruled Egypt, they remained culturally Greek. Inside the royal palace, Greek remained the language of government. Royal ceremonies blended Greek customs with Egyptian religious traditions. The dynasty carefully presented itself as both foreign rulers and divine Egyptian monarchs at the same time. It was an unusual balancing act. Some rulers managed it better than others. By the time Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE, the kingdom faced growing uncertainty. Rome had become stronger every year. Its influence stretched farther across the Mediterranean. Independent kingdoms increasingly found themselves negotiating with Roman generals instead of neighboring kings. Egypt still possessed immense wealth. The fertile Nile continued producing enormous harvests. Its grain fed millions. Its ports connected continents. Its treasures remained famous throughout the ancient world. But wealth alone could no longer guarantee safety. Political skill had become just as valuable as military strength. Perhaps no child understood this reality more completely than Cleopatra would eventually learn. Unlike many stories told about ancient queens, Cleopatra's childhood was probably filled less with luxury than with careful preparation. Members of royal families rarely enjoyed peaceful lives. Every lesson carried political importance. Every relationship might become an alliance or a threat. Every sibling could one day become either a trusted partner or a dangerous rival. The Ptolemaic court had a long history of family conflict. Brothers fought brothers. Sisters challenged sisters. Parents sometimes turned against their own children. Power inside the palace could shift with astonishing speed. Growing up within such an environment demanded sharp observation. A future ruler needed more than noble birth. She needed judgment, patience, memory, and above all, the ability to understand people. Ancient sources suggest Cleopatra received an exceptional education. She studied philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history. Unlike many previous rulers of her dynasty, she also learned the Egyptian language itself. This may seem like a small detail today. In reality, it was extraordinary. Many earlier Ptolemaic rulers never bothered to speak the language of most of their own subjects. Cleopatra chose differently. She reportedly mastered numerous languages throughout her lifetime. Ancient writers claimed she could converse without interpreters with representatives from many different peoples. Whether every language listed by later historians is accurate remains uncertain. Ancient authors sometimes exaggerated remarkable achievements, yet nearly all agree on one point. She possessed an extraordinary gift for communication. That talent would eventually become one of her greatest political weapons. Notice something curious. Already we have learned many things about Cleopatra. Her education, her multilingual abilities, her political environment, her intellectual interests, yet we still know almost nothing about her appearance. That silence is not accidental. History often preserves what people considered most important. If ancient writers repeatedly emphasized Cleopatra's mind instead of her face, perhaps they were telling us something valuable without realizing it. As evening slowly settles over Alexandria, lamps begin glowing inside homes across the city. Scholars continue copying scrolls by gentle lamplight. Sailors secure ropes along quiet docks. Temple priests prepare nightly rituals. Somewhere within the royal palace, a young princess studies maps, listens to tutors, practices languages, and observes the complicated world she may one day inherit. No one yet knows that her life will become one of history's most discussed stories. No one imagines that thousands of years later, people across the world will still debate a surprisingly simple question. Was Cleopatra truly famous for her beauty? Or did later generations quietly replace something even more extraordinary with a much easier legend? That question, like so many in history, has an answer far richer than the myth itself. And our journey is only just beginning. As our journey continues, let us remain in the quiet world of the first century before the Common Era, where the Mediterranean was connected by sea routes that carried not only goods, but also stories. Long before printing presses or newspapers existed, history traveled through conversations, handwritten scrolls, and the memories of those who believed their experiences were worth preserving. Some of those voices have survived, many have not. This simple fact is important whenever we try to understand Cleopatra. Unlike many famous figures from later history, Cleopatra never left behind a personal diary. No collection of private letters survives in her own handwriting. No autobiography tells us how she wished the world to remember her. Almost everything we know comes through the eyes of other people. Some admired her, some feared her, some disliked her. Others wrote decades or even centuries after she had died. Every one of them brought their own opinions, loyalties, and assumptions. Because of this, learning about Cleopatra is rather like standing beside a calm river whose surface reflects the sky. The reflection is real. Yet it is never exactly the same as the landscape itself. The challenge for historians is to look carefully beneath that reflection. One of the most important voices comes from Plutarch. Although Plutarch lived around a century after Cleopatra's lifetime, he had access to earlier records that no longer exist today. He also wrote about people whose lives shaped the Roman world, including Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. His work has remained valuable because he often cared about personality as much as political events. When modern readers first turn to Plutarch hoping to find glowing descriptions of Cleopatra's beauty, they are often surprised. He does not write that she possessed unmatched physical perfection. Instead, he offers something much more thoughtful. He explains that her beauty by itself was not necessarily incomparable. That sentence has fascinated historians for generations. Imagine how unexpected those words must feel. The woman whom popular culture would later crown as the world's greatest beauty was described by one of history's most influential writers as someone whose appearance alone was not beyond comparison. Plutarch then immediately shifts attention elsewhere. He tells us that what made Cleopatra unforgettable was not simply how she looked. It was the total effect of her presence, her conversation, her intelligence, her confidence, the charm of her voice, the grace with which she responded to others. According to him, spending time with Cleopatra created an impression stronger than merely seeing her face. This difference matters enormously. Physical beauty can capture attention for a moment. Personality can shape memory for a lifetime. Perhaps that was exactly what Plutarch wanted his readers to understand. He describes her voice almost as though it possessed music. Not because she sang constantly, but because speaking with her felt unusually pleasant. He suggests that she could adjust her manner to suit almost anyone she encountered. A philosopher might find an intelligent discussion. A military commander might discover strategic insight. A foreign ambassador could hear familiar words spoken in his own language. Each person left believing that they had experienced something rare. This is a very different image from the simplified legend that later developed. Instead of presenting Cleopatra as someone who relied only upon appearance, Plutarch portrays a ruler whose greatest gift lay in understanding human nature. She knew when to speak, when to listen, when to persuade, when to remain silent. These qualities rarely appear in paintings, yet they often shape history far more deeply than outward beauty ever can. Another important writer was Cassius Dio. Like Plutarch, he lived long after Cleopatra's death. His history of Rome remains one of the major surviving sources for this period. Dio certainly understood that Cleopatra had an extraordinary influence over powerful Roman leaders. Yet even he spends surprisingly little time praising unmatched beauty. Instead, he repeatedly returns to her intelligence and her ability to influence difficult political situations. His interest rests not in perfect facial features, but in remarkable leadership. This pattern begins appearing again and again. Different writers, different generations, different perspectives, yet the same conclusion quietly emerges. Cleopatra impressed people because she possessed unusual personal qualities that extended well beyond appearance. Modern readers sometimes expect ancient historians to describe every famous person's face in careful detail. In reality, they often did not. Unless appearance directly influenced a particular event, many ancient writers considered character far more interesting than physical description. Their audiences wanted lessons about leadership, ambition, courage, wisdom, failure, and fortune. External appearance mattered, but inner character usually mattered more. That is one reason why the surviving descriptions of Cleopatra feel so restrained. The people closest to her story did not spend page after page celebrating extraordinary beauty. Instead, they tried to explain
why intelligent Roman generals repeatedly found themselves fascinated by conversations with an Egyptian queen.
There is another detail worth considering. Ancient societies viewed beauty somewhat differently from the modern world. Today, photographs, films, and social media encourage constant comparison between faces. The ancient Mediterranean possessed no cameras. Portraits varied greatly according to artistic style. Idealized sculptures often represented political messages rather than exact likenesses. Coins simplified facial features because engravers worked on extremely small surfaces. Even painted portraits followed conventions that emphasized status as much as realism. This means people recognized rulers less by perfect physical accuracy than by symbols of authority. A crown, a hairstyle, royal clothing, sacred emblems. Power itself became part of appearance. Cleopatra understood this very well. As queen, she presented herself differently depending upon her audience. Before Egyptians, she could appear connected with the goddess Isis. Before Greeks, she emphasized her Hellenistic heritage. When negotiating with Romans, she displayed confidence equal to their greatest leaders. Each image communicated political meaning. Appearance became language, not vanity, but strategy. Imagine arriving in Alexandria as a foreign ambassador. You enter a magnificent palace overlooking one of the world's busiest harbors. You expect ceremony, luxury, perhaps even intimidation. Instead, you meet a ruler who greets you in your own language. Immediately, the distance between stranger and sovereign becomes smaller. You feel understood, respected, perhaps even surprised. That single moment might accomplish more than jewels or elaborate clothing ever could. Modern diplomacy still works in much the same way. Leaders often remember conversations more vividly than decorations. Words create trust. Listening creates influence. Cleopatra seems to have understood this instinctively. Historians cannot measure charm with numbers. They cannot excavate confidence from the ground like pottery fragments. Yet these invisible qualities appear repeatedly throughout the surviving evidence. Again and again, ancient writers hint that Cleopatra possessed an extraordinary ability to make others feel fully engaged. It is difficult to teach, even harder to describe. Perhaps that is why later generations gradually replaced it with something easier to imagine: beauty. Beauty can be painted, beauty can be sculpted, beauty can be exaggerated in stories. Charisma, however, is far more elusive. It exists only in living interaction. Once the people who experienced it are gone, only imperfect descriptions remain. Over centuries, imagination naturally filled the empty spaces. A queen capable of influencing Caesar and Antony must surely have been the most beautiful woman alive. At least that is what many later storytellers assumed. But history rarely rewards simple assumptions. Sometimes influence comes from knowledge, sometimes from confidence, sometimes from careful preparation, sometimes from extraordinary emotional intelligence, and sometimes from all of these qualities working together. The real Cleopatra appears increasingly human the closer we examine the evidence. Not a mythical enchantress, not an impossible beauty beyond comparison,
but an exceptionally educated ruler who understood politics, language, psychology, and leadership better than many of her contemporaries. Perhaps that reality is even more impressive than the legend. As night settles peacefully over Alexandria, gentle waves continue brushing against the harbor walls. The great lighthouse still sends its steady light across the dark sea. Inside quiet rooms, scribes continue copying histories that will outlive them by centuries. None of them can know that readers thousands of years in the future will still search their words for clues about one remarkable queen. And among those carefully preserved sentences lies one of history's greatest surprises. The people closest to Cleopatra remembered far more than a beautiful face. They remembered a brilliant mind, a captivating voice, and a presence impossible to forget. As our quiet journey continues, let us set aside the stories for a little while and turn instead towards something far more tangible. Unlike legends, coins do not rely upon memory. They can be held in the hand. They carry weight. They bear the marks of the people who created them. Long after palaces have disappeared and libraries have turned to dust, small pieces of metal often remain hidden beneath fields, riverbanks, and forgotten ruins, waiting patiently for someone to uncover them once again. For historians, coins are among the closest things to voices from the ancient world. They were not written to entertain. They were not intended to become famous centuries later. They were made for everyday life. People bought bread with them, paid sailors, rewarded soldiers, collected taxes, traded across ports stretching from Egypt to Greece and beyond. Every coin carried a message, not merely about money, but about power. When Cleopatra ruled Egypt, coins became one of the most important ways a monarch introduced themselves to the wider world. Most ordinary people would never meet their queen in person. Many would never visit Alexandria, yet they might hold her image in their own hands. That image mattered. It represented authority, stability, legitimacy, and sometimes ambition. Today, several surviving coins believed to portray Cleopatra have become the center of endless discussion. Modern readers often expect these portraits to resemble the glamorous paintings created many centuries later. Instead, they usually experience a quiet surprise. The woman shown on these coins does not look like the familiar Hollywood version of Cleopatra. Her nose appears strong and prominent. Her chin seems firm. Her jawline is clearly defined. The face projects confidence rather than delicate perfection. Some observers even describe these portraits as severe. Others believe they emphasize intelligence rather than youthful beauty. Still, others remind us to be careful before reaching conclusions. After all, ancient coins were never photographs. The engravers worked on surfaces barely larger than a fingertip. Every line had to be cut into hard metal with remarkable precision. Tiny details disappeared. Expressions became simplified. Features were often exaggerated, so they remained recognizable after repeated use. A realistic portrait was not always the goal. Recognition mattered more. Political symbolism mattered even more. This is something easily forgotten today.
Modern portraits often aim to capture exact appearances. Ancient royal portraits usually aim to communicate authority. A ruler wanted subjects to see strength, determination, continuity, confidence. These qualities inspired loyalty far more effectively than softness. Cleopatra understood this language of images remarkably well. She belonged to a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Every monarch before her had faced the same challenge. How should a ruler appear before millions of people who would never hear their voice? The answer lay in carefully crafted public images, strong profiles, royal hairstyles, diadems wrapped around the head, symbols associated with kingship. Each element quietly reinforced legitimacy. When modern historians compare Cleopatra's coins with those of her father and other members of the Ptolemaic dynasty, interesting similarities begin to emerge. Certain facial characteristics appear repeatedly throughout the royal family. Strong noses, pronounced chins, serious expressions. Rather than suggesting unattractiveness, these similarities may simply reflect the artistic traditions of the dynasty. Family resemblance itself became part of political identity. There is another fascinating possibility. Some scholars believe Cleopatra intentionally allowed her portraits to appear more powerful than conventionally beautiful. Imagine governing a kingdom surrounded by ambitious rivals. Rome grows stronger every year. Political alliances shift constantly. Civil wars erupt with alarming frequency. Would a queen wish to appear fragile? Or would she prefer an image that quietly announces confidence and determination? Strength itself can become a form of beauty. Not beauty in the modern sense, but beauty understood through leadership. The ancient world often admired faces that reflected courage, discipline, and intelligence. Physical perfection alone rarely guaranteed respect. In fact, appearing overly concerned with personal attractiveness might even weaken a ruler's image. Authority required balance, confidence without arrogance, grace without weakness, presence without excess. Perhaps Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. Her surviving portraits seem designed less to flatter and more to command attention. Imagine one of these newly minted coins leaving the royal workshop in Alexandria. Freshly struck, its surface catches the morning sunlight. Workers count stacks carefully before distributing them throughout the kingdom. Some travel north aboard merchant ships. Others move south along the Nile. Months later, a farmer purchasing grain may briefly examine the queen's profile before passing the coin to someone else. Years later, the same coin changes hands again. Eventually, it disappears beneath the earth. Centuries pass, empires rise, empires fall, languages change, religions spread, entire civilizations transform. Yet beneath layers of soil, the queen's portrait quietly waits. More than 2,000 years later, archaeologists carefully brush away the dust. For the first time in centuries, sunlight touches Cleopatra's face again. Not the face imagined by poets, not the face painted by Renaissance artists, but the face chosen by her own government to represent royal authority. It is an extraordinary moment, not because the coin answers every question, rather because it reminds us how little certainty history sometimes allows. Coins alone cannot tell us whether Cleopatra was conventionally beautiful. Neither can statues, nor scattered written descriptions. Instead, they invite us to ask a different question. Why are we so determined to know? Perhaps because modern culture places enormous value upon appearance. We often assume that remarkable influence must begin with remarkable beauty. Yet history repeatedly offers quieter explanations. Knowledge, preparation, patience, education, political instinct, emotional intelligence, the ability to read people accurately, the courage to remain calm during uncertainty. These qualities rarely leave visible marks upon the face, yet they shape destinies. Cleopatra seems to have possessed many of them. That may explain why the people who actually encountered her remembered conversations more vividly than physical details. Even Roman writers who opposed her rarely dismissed her intelligence. They criticized her ambitions. They questioned her alliances. They feared her influence. But almost none portrayed her as an empty figure relying solely upon appearance. That silence itself speaks volumes. It reminds us that the real Cleopatra stood at the center of one of history's greatest political dramas. She negotiated with Julius Caesar. She governed an enormously wealthy kingdom. She navigated alliances that determined the future of entire civilizations. These achievements required far more than beauty. They required judgment. The coins quietly reinforce this reality. Their message is not one of vanity. It is one of sovereignty. Every carefully engraved line proclaims the existence of a queen determined to be recognized as a legitimate ruler in an increasingly dangerous world. As evening slowly returns to Alexandria, the city's markets begin growing quieter. Merchants finish counting the day's earnings. Some of those coins bear the familiar profile of their queen. Children chase one another through narrow streets. Ships rock gently against wooden docks. Far above them, the great lighthouse continues, sending its calm light across the sea, just as it has every night before. Within the royal palace, Cleopatra understands that every decision she makes will be judged not only by her own people, but also by the powerful men watching from Rome. In such a world, appearance is never merely appearance. It is politics. It is diplomacy. It is survival. And soon we will meet the first Roman leader who would come to understand that better than almost anyone else. His name was Julius Caesar. Their meeting would forever change both of their lives and the course of history itself. The Mediterranean has always been a sea of journeys. Its waters have carried merchants searching for opportunity, scholars pursuing knowledge, pilgrims seeking faith, and armies marching toward uncertain futures. Every generation has watched new ships appear on the horizon, each bringing stories that would soon become part of history. During the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, one man stood above almost every other figure in the Roman world. His victories had transformed the Republic. His ambitions inspired admiration in some and deep anxiety in others. His name was Julius Caesar. By the time Cleopatra's path crossed with his, Caesar was no young conqueror chasing his first triumph. He was already one of the most experienced political and military leaders of his age. He had spent decades navigating battles, negotiations, betrayals, and shifting alliances. He understood power perhaps better than almost anyone alive. This detail is worth remembering. Later legends often suggest that Cleopatra simply enchanted Caesar with extraordinary beauty. It is an appealing story because it feels simple. Yet history rarely unfolds through simple explanations. Caesar had traveled widely. He had met queens, noblewomen, diplomats, generals, and rulers from many lands. He had survived civil wars and political conspiracies that demanded constant judgment. Such a man was unlikely to risk everything merely because someone possessed an attractive face. Something far more substantial must have drawn his attention. To understand their meeting, we first need to understand the crisis surrounding Egypt. When Cleopatra's father died, the kingdom followed the traditions of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, were expected to rule together. On paper, the arrangement appeared stable. Reality proved much more complicated. The young king's advisors soon gained enormous influence over the royal court. Political rivalries intensified. Trust slowly disappeared. Before long, Cleopatra found herself pushed away from power. She left Alexandria and began gathering supporters beyond the capital. It was an uncertain and dangerous moment. Meanwhile, events in Rome were moving just as rapidly. Caesar had defeated his rival Pompey during the Roman Civil War. Pompey fled across the Mediterranean, hoping Egypt might offer refuge. Instead, the advisors surrounding the young Ptolemy made a decision they believed would please Caesar. Pompey was murdered shortly after reaching Egyptian shores. His severed head was presented as a gift. The gesture had the opposite effect. Rather than celebrating, Caesar reportedly felt deep disappointment. Pompey had been his enemy, but he had also once been his ally and son-in-law. The killing represented political calculation stripped of honor. Instead of solving Egypt's problems, it drew Rome even more deeply into them. Caesar entered Alexandria with only a limited military force. His original purpose had not been to conquer Egypt outright. Rather, he intended to stabilize the kingdom and settle the royal dispute. Yet the situation quickly became far more complicated than anyone expected. Somewhere during these tense days came one of history's most famous stories. According to later tradition, Cleopatra arranged to meet Caesar in secret. Unable to enter the palace openly because of political danger, she was reportedly brought inside, wrapped in a bundle of fabric or rolled within a large carpet. The image has fascinated storytellers for centuries. It appears in paintings, novels, films, and television dramas. It is dramatic, memorable, almost theatrical. Whether every detail happened exactly as later writers described remains uncertain. Ancient historians often enjoyed telling vivid stories that captured larger truths,
even when smaller details became embellished over time. Yet regardless of how Cleopatra entered Caesar's presence, the essential point remains remarkably consistent. She chose boldness. Instead of hiding from events, she stepped directly into the center of them. Imagine the situation from Caesar's perspective.
A young queen, separated from power, enters a palace controlled by political rivals. She knows her life may depend upon the conversation about to begin. She cannot rely upon soldiers. She cannot rely upon family loyalty. She cannot rely upon overwhelming military strength. She possesses only herself, her education, her confidence, her intelligence, her understanding of politics. Every word matters. Every pause carries meaning. Every answer may influence the future of an entire kingdom. This was not the setting for idle romance. It was one of the most consequential political meetings of the ancient world. Although later generations often focused upon attraction, historians increasingly recognized something deeper. Cleopatra presented herself not as someone begging for rescue, but as a legitimate ruler, capable of governing Egypt. She needed Caesar to see beyond the immediate conflict. She needed him to understand that supporting her offered greater stability than trusting inexperienced advisors surrounding her brother. That required careful reasoning, strategic thinking, and extraordinary composure. Caesar himself appreciated intelligence. Throughout his career, he surrounded himself with capable advisors, skilled administrators, and educated companions. He admired quick thinking. He respected decisive leadership, and it is therefore hardly surprising that Cleopatra's intellect left such a strong impression. Plutarch later emphasized the pleasure of her conversation rather than simply her appearance. That observation suddenly makes perfect sense. A conversation between Cleopatra and Caesar would not have revolved around compliments or appearances. They likely discussed armies, finances, the Nile, Roman politics, trade routes, the future of Egypt, the fragile balance of power across the Mediterranean. Each recognized that the other possessed knowledge worth hearing. Mutual respect often begins this way, not through appearance alone, but through understanding. As their discussions continued, Caesar gradually supported Cleopatra's claim to the throne. The decision immediately intensified tensions inside Alexandria. Supporters of Ptolemy resisted. Conflict spread through the city. The famous Alexandrian War followed. Battles erupted in streets and around the royal quarter. Ships burned in the harbor. The city experienced weeks of uncertainty. Eventually, Caesar's forces emerged victorious. Ptolemy XIII died while attempting to escape across the Nile. Cleopatra regained her position as queen. Yet even then, the story did not become one of simple romance. Politics remained inseparable from every decision. Egypt needed Roman friendship. Rome benefited from Egypt's immense wealth and reliable grain supplies. Their alliance served practical purposes, extending far beyond personal affection. In time, Cleopatra gave birth to a son known as Ptolemy XV, whom later generations often called Caesarion. Many believe Julius Caesar was the child's father. The claim carried enormous political significance. If true, Caesarion represented both the Egyptian royalty and a direct connection to Rome's most powerful leader. for Cleopatra. Such a relationship strengthened her position enormously. For Rome, however, it introduced new uncertainties into an already unstable political landscape. Even so, notice what remains absent from the surviving historical evidence. No ancient writer claims that Caesar abandoned reason because Cleopatra possessed unmatched physical beauty. Instead, they consistently portray a relationship shaped by intelligence, political necessity, mutual respect, and shared ambition.
The myth of irresistible beauty belongs largely to later centuries. The historical record feels quieter, more complex, and perhaps more believable. Imagine the evenings that followed their earliest meetings.
Beyond the palace walls, Alexandria continued its endless rhythm. Fishermen prepared boats before dawn. Scholars debated philosophy beneath shaded courtyards. Merchants unloaded cargo from distant shores. Children laughed in narrow streets. Life moved forward even while kings and queens determined the future. Inside the palace, conversations likely continued late into the night. Maps spread across polished tables. Reports arrived from military commanders. Messengers carried news from Rome. Every decision required careful thought. There was little room for fantasy. Only responsibility. Only consequence. Only history, quietly unfolding one conversation at a time. Perhaps this is why Cleopatra continues to fascinate us. Not because she fits the legend created centuries later, but because the real woman appears far more remarkable. She entered one of the most dangerous political situations imaginable. She faced the greatest Roman statesman of her age. And she emerged not as a prisoner, not as an exile, but once again as Queen of Egypt. That achievement cannot be explained by beauty alone. It speaks, instead of preparation, of courage, of intelligence, and of a rare ability to recognize opportunity even in moments of greatest uncertainty. The moon now rises gently above Alexandria. Its silver light reflects across the calm waters of the harbor. Somewhere within the palace, Cleopatra's future has begun to change. Yet beyond Egypt, the Roman Republic is slowly approaching its own moment of transformation. Neither Caesar nor Cleopatra can yet see the shadows gathering ahead. Soon, events in Rome will bring triumph, tragedy, and a new chapter that will place another remarkable Roman into Cleopatra's life. His name will become forever linked with hers, and together they will create one of history's most enduring legends. The years have moved quietly onward. The waters of the Mediterranean continue to rise and fall against familiar shores, just as they always have. Merchant ships still cross the sea, carrying grain from Egypt, wine from Greece, olive oil from Italy, and stories from every port they visit. The world appears much the same on the surface, yet beneath that calm rhythm, everything has begun to change. Julius Caesar is gone. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, the man who had reshaped the Roman Republic was assassinated by members of the Roman Senate. They believed they were saving their republic from tyranny. Instead, they opened the door to another long period of uncertainty.
News of Caesar's death spread slowly across the Mediterranean. Messengers traveled by horse and ship. Weeks passed before distant cities fully understood what had happened. In Alexandria, Cleopatra would have recognized immediately that the political world she had carefully navigated was changing once again. Her alliance with Caesar had strengthened Egypt's position. Now that foundation had suddenly disappeared. Once more, the future seemed uncertain. History often reminds us that great rulers rarely enjoy long periods of stability. No sooner is one challenge overcome than another quietly approaches. For Cleopatra, survival depended upon adapting faster than circumstances changed around her. Meanwhile, Rome struggled to decide who would inherit Caesar's enormous influence. Several powerful figures emerged. Among them stood Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony. To many modern readers, Antony appears primarily as the man who fell in love with Cleopatra. Yet before their famous relationship began, he already possessed a remarkable reputation. He was an experienced military commander, a loyal supporter of Caesar, a capable leader admired by soldiers for sharing their hardships rather than avoiding them. Ancient writers frequently described him as generous, courageous, and energetic. They also noted qualities that sometimes complicated his political career. He enjoyed celebrations. He appreciated luxury. He could be impulsive. He sometimes trusted emotion more than careful calculation. Like many historical figures, Antony combined genuine strengths with unmistakable weaknesses. These qualities made him deeply human. After Caesar's assassination, Rome entered another civil war. Political alliances shifted with astonishing speed. Eventually, Antony joined forces with Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, and Lepidus. Together they formed what historians call the Second Triumvirate. Their purpose was simple: defeat Caesar's assassins, restore order, divide responsibility for governing Rome's vast territories. Once victory had been secured, Antony assumed control over Rome's eastern provinces. This decision would eventually bring him face to face with Cleopatra once again. Several years had passed since she had first met Julius Caesar. She was no longer merely a young queen defending her throne. She had become a far more experienced ruler. She understood Roman politics better than before. She had strengthened Egypt's administration. She had carefully preserved her kingdom while larger powers struggled around her. Experience has a quiet way of changing people. It rarely announces itself. Instead, it appears gradually in confidence, patience, and judgment. By the time Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus, both leaders understood exactly how much depended upon their conversation. Roman officials had questions about Egypt's recent actions during the civil wars. Antony wanted explanations. Cleopatra wanted security. Neither could afford misunderstanding. This meeting has inspired countless paintings over the centuries. Artists often filled their canvases with dazzling fabrics, golden barges, exotic perfumes, and overwhelming displays of luxury. Some ancient sources indeed describe Cleopatra arriving aboard a magnificent royal vessel. Purple sails drifted above polished decks. Silver oars caught the sunlight with every stroke. Fragrant incense floated gently through the warm air. Musicians played softly as the ship approached the shore. Whether every decorative detail is completely accurate matters less than the larger point. Cleopatra understood symbolism. First impressions could influence negotiations long before the first word was spoken. Modern diplomacy still follows similar principles. State visits involve carefully planned ceremonies, flags, music, formal welcomes, elegant surroundings. None of these replace serious discussion. Instead, they create an atmosphere reflecting respect and confidence. Cleopatra appears to have mastered this art exceptionally well. Yet once again, something interesting happens when we examine the ancient evidence closely. The surviving writers devote remarkable attention not merely to Cleopatra's appearance, but to the effect of her entire presence, her confidence, her conversation, her wit, her intelligence, her ability to shape the emotional atmosphere around her. Beauty alone cannot explain such descriptions. Imagine Antony waiting to receive Egypt's queen. He had commanded armies across distant provinces. He had witnessed countless royal ceremonies. Very little in public life could genuinely surprise him. Yet when Cleopatra arrived, ancient writers suggest that the meeting unfolded unlike any ordinary diplomatic audience. Not because she simply looked beautiful, but because every element of her presentation reflected careful thought. The setting, the timing, the conversation, the confidence with which she carried herself. She understood that politics often begins long before formal negotiations. Antony, for his part, seems to have appreciated individuals possessing courage and intelligence. Military leaders frequently recognize these qualities in others because they depend upon them daily. Decision-making under pressure, quick judgment, adaptability. These traits command respect regardless of gender or nationality. As discussions continued, Antony and Cleopatra discovered shared interests extending beyond politics. Both appreciated Greek culture. Both enjoyed intellectual conversation. Both possessed ambitious visions for the future. Both also carried enormous responsibilities. Their relationship gradually deepened over time. Later generations often reduced it to a romantic tale. The historical reality appears considerably richer. Certainly, affection developed between them. Ancient writers leave little doubt about that. Yet affection existed alongside political partnership. Egypt needed Roman protection. Antony required Egypt's wealth, naval resources, and financial support for future military campaigns. Their alliance benefited both sides. History rarely separates love from politics when rulers are involved. Kings and queens almost never possessed the luxury of purely private relationships. Every personal decision carried public consequences. Every friendship influenced diplomacy. Every marriage altered alliances. Every child affected succession. Cleopatra and Antony lived within precisely such a world. This does not diminish genuine emotion. Rather, it reminds us that human relationships often unfold within larger historical circumstances. One does not cancel the other. Ancient historians occasionally criticized Antony for becoming too influenced by Cleopatra. Many of these criticisms originated from writers sympathetic to Octavian, who would eventually become Augustus. Rome's first emperor. Political propaganda became a powerful weapon during their rivalry.
Presenting Antony as a Roman leader distracted by a foreign queen served Octavian's interests remarkably well. This point deserves careful reflection. Much of Cleopatra's later reputation developed through Roman political storytelling. Octavian needed Romans to believe he was defending traditional Roman values against dangerous foreign influence. Cleopatra became the perfect symbol for that narrative. Over time, political propaganda gradually transformed into historical tradition. The image of the irresistible temptress became easier to remember than the reality of an exceptionally capable monarch. This transformation happened slowly. Generation after generation repeated familiar stories. Each retelling added new layers. Beauty became more extraordinary. Romance became more dramatic. Reality quietly stepped into the background. Yet if we return once more to the earliest evidence, we encounter a more balanced picture. Cleopatra governed effectively. She maintained Egypt's economy. She negotiated with one of Rome's most powerful commanders. She supported complex military campaigns. She managed diplomacy across multiple kingdoms. These achievements demanded sustained intelligence. No amount of physical attractiveness alone could accomplish them. Imagine one peaceful evening in Alexandria during these years. The heat of the day begins to soften. Golden sunlight stretches across some marble columns before slowly fading into gentle twilight. The harbor grows quieter. Fishing boats return with their final catches. The smell of fresh bread drifts through nearby streets. Inside the palace, lamps are lit one by one. Maps lie open across polished tables. Reports arrive from governors and naval commanders. Cleopatra and Antony discuss plans extending far beyond the walls surrounding them. They speak of Rome, of Parthia, of Egypt, of trade, of armies, of children, of futures still uncertain. Outside, ordinary life continues almost unchanged. Families prepare evening meals. Scholars continue reading beneath oil lamps. Children laugh before sleep slowly overtakes the city. History often unfolds this way. The greatest decisions are made while countless ordinary moments continue quietly all around them. Perhaps that is one of history's gentlest lessons. Extraordinary lives are still lived within ordinary evenings. The legends would later tell us that Antony was conquered by Cleopatra's beauty. The surviving evidence tells a subtler story. He admired a queen whose confidence matched her intelligence, a ruler who understood diplomacy as deeply as any Roman statesman, a woman capable of standing beside the most powerful men of her age as an equal. That truth may lack the simplicity of legend, yet it possesses something even more enduring. It feels unmistakably human. The night grows still above Alexandria. Stars appear one by one across the Egyptian sky. Far beyond the palace walls, another Roman leader watches events unfold with increasing concern. His name is Octavian. He understands that defeating Antony alone will not be enough. He must also shape the story that Rome believes. And in the years ahead, That story will change Cleopatra's reputation more profoundly than anything she ever did during her lifetime.
Night settles gently across the Mediterranean. The sea, so often filled with the sounds of merchants, sailors, and distant voices, becomes calm beneath a sky scattered with quiet stars. Along the shores of Egypt, waves continue their endless conversation with the sand, just as they had long before Cleopatra was born, and as they would long after she was gone. History rarely changes all at once. More often, it changes through stories. One generation tells a story in one way. The next generation repeats it with small adjustments. Over time, those adjustments become accepted as truth. Eventually, few people remember where the story truly began. This is exactly what happened to Cleopatra. Until now, we have met the queen through ancient writers, surviving coins,
and the major events of her life. Again and again, we have noticed something rather surprising. The people closest to her lifetime emphasized her intelligence, her education, her political skill, and her remarkable presence, far more often than they praised extraordinary physical beauty. Yet somewhere along history's long road, Cleopatra transformed into something very different. She became the world's most famous seductress. How did that happen? The answer leads us not to Egypt, but to Rome. Following the growing partnership between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the Roman world became increasingly divided. The uneasy cooperation between Antony and Octavian slowly dissolved. At first, disagreements remained political. Then they became personal. Soon they became impossible to ignore. Both men understood that another civil war was approaching. Neither could rule comfortably while the other remained powerful. Victory in Rome required more than military strength. It also required public support. Roman citizens had to believe that one side represented the future of their republic. That belief could not be won by swords alone. It had to be shaped by words. Long before modern newspapers, radio broadcasts, or television campaigns, political leaders understood the extraordinary power of public opinion. Speeches traveled through crowded forums. Poems spread from reader to reader. Rumors crossed marketplaces. Official announcements appeared in public places. Every message carried purpose. Every story could strengthen one leader while weakening another. Octavian proved exceptionally skilled at this kind of political communication. He recognized something important. Attacking Antony directly might divide Roman opinion. Many soldiers admired Antony. Many citizens remembered his loyalty to Julius Caesar. Many respected his military achievements, but there was another possibility. Rather than portraying Antony as Rome's enemy, Octavian could suggest that Antony had fallen under the dangerous influence of a foreign queen. This strategy accomplished several goals at once. It preserved Antony's reputation as a capable Roman while suggesting he had abandoned Roman values. At the same time, it transformed Cleopatra into the central threat. Instead of presenting the coming conflict as another Roman civil war, Octavian gradually framed it as Rome defending itself against an ambitious Eastern monarch. It was a brilliant political strategy. Roman citizens were growing tired of endless civil wars. The idea of fighting another Roman commander held little appeal. But defending Rome against a foreign queen? That sounded very different. The conflict suddenly became easier to justify. Cleopatra therefore became more than an individual. She became a symbol. Political symbols rarely resemble the complicated people upon whom they are based. Instead, they become simplified, exaggerated.
shaped to fit the needs of those telling the story. In Octavian's version, Cleopatra was no longer primarily an intelligent ruler protecting Egypt. She became a dangerous enchantress capable of corrupting even Rome's greatest leaders. Notice what happened. Her intelligence did not disappear.
Instead, it was transformed into manipulation. Her confidence became arrogance. Her diplomacy became deception. Her political partnerships became irresistible seduction. The same qualities received entirely different interpretations depending upon who described them. History often works this way. The victors rarely invent everything from nothing. More commonly, they rearrange existing facts into a new narrative. Octavian's supporters described Antony as neglecting Roman traditions. They claimed he had become too comfortable living in Alexandria, too fascinated by Egyptian customs, too willing to place Cleopatra's interests above Rome's. Whether these accusations reflected reality completely is another matter. Political campaigns rarely depend upon perfect accuracy. They depend upon persuasive storytelling. As months passed, these stories spread throughout the Republic. Citizens who had never met Cleopatra formed vivid opinions about her. Many imagined a queen whose beauty overwhelmed reason itself. The image proved remarkably powerful. It explained Antony's choices in a simple way. Rather than acknowledging complex political calculations, strategic alliances, and genuine affection, people could believe that one extraordinary woman had simply bewitched a Roman hero. Simple stories travel easily. Complicated truths move much more slowly. Eventually, the growing rivalry reached its inevitable conclusion. In 31 BCE, the opposing fleets met near the western coast of Greece at the Battle of Actium. This would become one of history's most decisive naval engagements. The sea that had carried merchants and scholars for centuries now carried warships instead. Hundreds of vessels maneuvered across the water. Thousands of sailors and soldiers waited for commands that would shape the future of the Mediterranean. Ancient writers describe confusion, courage, fear, determination, and exhaustion. The battle unfolded over many hours. At a critical moment, Cleopatra's ships withdrew. Soon afterward, Antony followed. Exactly why events unfolded as they did remains debated among historians. Ancient accounts sometimes contradict one another. Some suggest careful planning. Others describe panic. Still others hint at strategic necessity. History rarely offers complete certainty. What is certain is the outcome. Octavian emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Alexandria remained magnificent. Its lighthouse still guided ships safely towards the harbor. Its scholars continued reading ancient texts. Its markets remained busy, yet an unmistakable sense of uncertainty now hovered over the kingdom. Everyone understood that Rome's attention would soon turn toward Egypt itself. When Octavian eventually entered Alexandria the following year, the story reached its tragic conclusion. Antony died. Soon afterward, Cleopatra also died. The exact details surrounding her final hours remain among history's enduring mysteries. Ancient writers disagree on several important points. Some describe the famous asp. Others suggest poison prepared in another form. Absolute certainty remains beyond our reach. Yet regardless of the method, her death marked the end of more than a single life. It marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It marked the end of independent pharaonic Egypt.
For the first time in centuries, Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian had achieved complete victory, yet military victory alone was not enough.
Now came the task of shaping memory. Future generations would remember events largely through Roman voices. Those voices naturally reflected Roman priorities. The defeated seldom preserve history as successfully as the victorious. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cleopatra's historical identity continued changing. The capable monarch faded. The irresistible temptress grew larger. Poets embraced the dramatic version. Playwrights discovered endless possibilities. Artists painted scenes filled with romance and luxury. Centuries later, Shakespeare would introduce audiences to his unforgettable vision of Antony and Cleopatra. Even later came operas, paintings, novels, silent films, Hollywood epics. Each generation added another layer to the legend. By then, very few people returned to Plutarch's quiet observation that her beauty itself was not beyond comparison. Instead, imagination filled the silence left by history. And perhaps that is understandable. Legends satisfy something deep within human nature. They offer clear heroes, clear villains, clear explanations. Real history is gentler, messier, filled with uncertainty. The real Cleopatra was neither a flawless beauty nor an evil enchantress. She was a queen navigating one of the most dangerous political landscapes of the ancient world. She made wise decisions. She made costly mistakes. She loved. She ruled. She negotiated. She endured. Like every human being, she cannot be reduced to a single characteristic. As midnight approaches, Alexandria rests beneath a peaceful sky. The palace that once echoed with conversations between Cleopatra and her advisors has fallen silent. The harbor remains, the sea remains, the stars remain. Empires may rise and disappear, yet the rhythms of nature continue with remarkable patience. Somewhere, centuries later, a Roman historian begins writing another account of these remarkable events. He dips his pen into ink and carefully chooses each word. Without realizing it, he is helping shape an image that will survive for more than 2,000 years. An image that millions will accept without question. Yet beneath every legend, the quieter truth still waits, patiently, calmly, ready for anyone willing to look a little deeper. And in our next journey, we will discover how Renaissance artists, playwrights, and eventually Hollywood complete the transformation of Cleopatra into the beauty icon the modern world believes it already knows. The centuries pass almost unnoticed. The voices that once echoed through the royal palace of Alexandria have long since faded into silence. Marble halls have crumbled. Royal gardens have disappeared beneath layers of earth. The famous ships that once crossed the Mediterranean have become fragments, resting quietly on the seabed. Yet stories have a curious way of surviving when buildings do not. Sometimes a story becomes even stronger after the people who lived it are gone. It grows. It changes. It gathers new details from every generation that chooses to tell it again. Few historical figures demonstrate this more clearly than Cleopatra. By the time the Roman Empire itself had risen, flourished, and eventually begun its slow transformation, Cleopatra was no longer remembered simply as the last queen of Egypt. She had already begun becoming something larger than history. She was becoming legend. When we think about history today, it is easy to imagine that every generation has always had access to the same information we possess now. In reality, knowledge has never traveled so easily. Ancient books,
disappeared. Libraries burned, scrolls decayed.
Wars scattered collections across distant lands. Many first-hand accounts vanished forever. Each century inherited only fragments of the one before. As a result, every generation rebuilt Cleopatra's story using whatever pieces remained.
Sometimes those pieces fit together surprisingly well. Sometimes imagination quietly filled the empty spaces. During the Middle Ages, much of Western Europe knew Cleopatra only through scattered references preserved in Latin manuscripts. She remained a fascinating figure, but not yet the universally recognized symbol of beauty she would later become. That transformation accelerated during the Renaissance. Across Italy and other parts of Europe, artists, scholars, and writers rediscovered many surviving works from Greece and Rome. Ancient history suddenly returned to public attention with renewed enthusiasm. Classical heroes filled paintings. Roman leaders appeared in sculptures. Greek philosophers inspired new discussions.
Among all these rediscovered figures stood Cleopatra. Renaissance artists faced an interesting challenge. No one knew exactly what Cleopatra had looked like. They possessed ancient texts. They had a few surviving coins. But those coins hardly resembled the graceful women favored by Renaissance artistic ideals. Painters therefore made a choice. Rather than attempting strict historical reconstruction, they often portrayed Cleopatra according to the beauty standards of their own time. She acquired softer features, elegant skin, perfect proportions, luxurious clothing. Inspired more by Renaissance fashion than by ancient Egypt, without intending deception, these artists quietly reshaped history. Viewers naturally assumed these paintings reflected reality. Few realized they were actually looking at 16th century ideals projected backward across more than 1,500 years. Art possesses extraordinary influence. Many people remember images more vividly than written words. A single famous painting can shape public imagination for generations. Cleopatra benefited and perhaps suffered from this remarkable power. As more artists painted her, their versions began influencing one another. Each new portrait borrowed familiar elements from earlier works: golden jewelry, dark flowing hair, graceful posture, captivating expression. The historical queen slowly disappeared beneath an increasingly idealized image. Then came literature. Among the greatest storytellers ever to write in English was William Shakespeare. Around the beginning of the 17th century, he composed Antony and Cleopatra. Even today, the play remains one of his most celebrated works. Shakespeare did not intend to write a modern history textbook. He wrote drama. His goal was to explore love, ambition, pride, loyalty, aging, and the cost of power. Within that dramatic world, Cleopatra became unforgettable. She appears intelligent, passionate, playful, proud, emotionally complex, commanding. She changes moods with astonishing speed. She laughs, she grieves, she challenges, she inspires. Perhaps more than anything else, Shakespeare presents her as impossible to ignore. Although beauty certainly forms part of her theatrical image, it is never the whole story. In fact, audiences often remember her words more than her appearance, her wit, her confidence, her emotional depth. Interestingly, Shakespeare's Cleopatra resembles Plutarch's observations more closely than many later interpretations would. Once again, personality shines brighter than simple physical beauty. Yet audiences naturally imagined her as extraordinarily attractive because theater relies upon visual imagination as much as dialogue. The legend continued growing. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe developed an enormous fascination with ancient Egypt. Travelers returned with sketches of temples and monuments. Archaeologists uncovered forgotten tombs. Museums displayed statues and artifacts from the Nile Valley.
Egypt became associated with mystery, grandeur, and timeless elegance. Cleopatra fit perfectly within this fascination. Artists surrounded her with towering columns, golden thrones, jeweled crowns, and magnificent palaces.
The paintings became increasingly dramatic. She reclined upon luxurious couches. Attendants surrounded her. Rich fabrics flowed across every scene. Everything appeared larger than life. Again, history quietly blended with imagination.
Then photography arrived. Soon afterward came cinema. The 20th century transformed storytelling forever. Millions of people could now experience historical dramas, not only through books or paintings, but upon enormous screens. Hollywood recognized immediately that Cleopatra offered everything audiences loved. Romance, power, war, luxury, tragedy, ancient civilizations, and above all, unforgettable spectacle. Several actresses portrayed Cleopatra during the early decades of film history. Each interpretation reflected contemporary ideas of beauty. Costumes changed, hairstyles changed, makeup changed. Yet one message remained remarkably consistent. Cleopatra was presented as the most beautiful woman of her age. Perhaps no film influenced public imagination more than the 1963 epic Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor. The production became legendary. Its enormous budget attracted worldwide attention. Its elaborate sets recreated ancient Alexandria with breathtaking scale. Thousands of costumes were carefully designed. Jewelry sparkled beneath brilliant studio lights. Taylor herself possessed extraordinary screen presence. For millions of viewers around the world, her face became Cleopatra's face. The influence proved immense. Even people who had never studied ancient history began imagining Cleopatra exactly this way. Yet historians gently remind us that Elizabeth Taylor portrayed Cleopatra according to 20th century cinematic ideals, not archaeological certainty. There is nothing wrong with artistic interpretation. Films are created to tell emotionally engaging stories. The difficulty arises only when audiences mistake artistic imagination for historical evidence. Curiously, while Hollywood emphasized beauty more than almost any earlier tradition, modern historical scholarship quietly moved in the opposite direction. Archaeologists continued excavating. Numismatists studied surviving coins. Historians re-examined ancient texts. Linguists translated forgotten inscriptions. Piece by piece, the historical Cleopatra slowly reappeared. Not less remarkable, perhaps even more remarkable. Researchers increasingly concluded that her greatest strength lay not in extraordinary physical appearance, but in extraordinary capability. She governed a wealthy kingdom during one of history's most unstable periods. She mastered languages. She negotiated with Rome's greatest leaders. She protected Egyptian independence for as long as circumstances allowed. She understood economics, diplomacy, religion, symbolism, and political theater. Few rulers of any age demonstrated such a wide range of abilities. Modern audiences sometimes find this conclusion almost surprising. Perhaps because we have inherited centuries of paintings, plays, novels, and films celebrating beauty above everything else. Yet when we quietly return to the earliest evidence, the emphasis shifts once more. The ancient writers who actually discussed Cleopatra most carefully admired something deeper: presence, conversation, learning, confidence, charisma, intelligence. Those qualities are difficult to paint, difficult to photograph, almost impossible to preserve across 2,000 years. Beauty can be imagined. Charisma must be experienced. That difference may explain why later generations gradually replaced one with the other. As evening falls over the modern city of Alexandria, very little remains visible of the royal palace where Cleopatra once lived. The sea continues touching the same shoreline. The wind still carries the scent of salt across the harbor. Somewhere beneath the water, archaeologists believe fragments of the ancient palace still rest quietly, hidden beneath centuries of change. History often feels like that submerged palace. Most of it remains unseen. Only scattered pieces emerge into the light. Each discovery reminds us how much still lies beneath the surface. Cleopatra's true story is much the same. For centuries, the legend floated above the water, dazzling and unforgettable. Now, little by little, the quieter truth rises from below. It tells us about a queen whose greatest gift was never simply the face she showed the world. It was the mind behind it. And perhaps that is why more than 2,000 years after her death, historians continue returning to her life, not to admire an impossible beauty, but to understand one of history's most extraordinary women. The deeper we travel into history, the quieter it becomes. The loud voices of legend slowly fade into the distance, leaving behind only scattered fragments of evidence waiting patiently to be understood. A weathered coin, a line written by an ancient historian, a broken inscription, the remains of a palace resting beneath the waters of Alexandria. Unlike stories, these fragments never try to entertain us. They simply exist. They ask only that we look carefully. For generations, historians have done exactly that. Every new discovery has added another small piece to the remarkable puzzle that is Cleopatra. Sometimes those discoveries have confirmed old beliefs. More often they have challenged them. Today, after centuries of careful research, many historians agree upon something that would probably surprise much of the modern world. The real Cleopatra was almost certainly far more extraordinary than the legend that replaced her. That statement may sound unusual at first. Legends usually make people seem greater than they really were. In Cleopatra's case, the opposite may be true. The legend reduced her. It narrowed an exceptionally complex ruler into a single characteristic: beauty. Yet no human life, especially one that shaped the future of nations, can be understood through a single word. Modern historians therefore begin in a different place. Rather than asking whether Cleopatra was beautiful, they ask what kind of ruler she was. The answers reveal a woman of remarkable ability. She inherited a kingdom facing enormous pressure. The Roman Republic was expanding rapidly. Independent kingdoms across the Mediterranean were disappearing one after another. Powerful rulers who made poor decisions often lost everything within a few years. Egypt, however, remained independent throughout Cleopatra's reign. That alone deserves careful attention. Maintaining independence required extraordinary political judgment. Every alliance carried risks. Every diplomatic decision could alter the future. Every mistake might invite Roman intervention.
Cleopatra ruled for more than 2 decades under exactly these conditions. That was no small achievement. One of the qualities modern scholars admire most is her education. Ancient sources consistently describe her as exceptionally well educated. She studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, rhetoric, medicine, literature, and history. These were not subjects learned merely for personal enjoyment. They prepared rulers to govern. Philosophy encouraged careful reasoning. Rhetoric developed persuasive speech. History offered lessons from earlier generations. Mathematics supported administration and taxation. Astronomy helped regulate calendars and agriculture. Knowledge itself became an instrument of leadership. Perhaps even more impressive was her ability with languages. Plutarch tells us that Cleopatra could speak with many different peoples without relying upon interpreters. Exactly how many languages she mastered remains uncertain. Ancient writers sometimes enjoyed emphasizing remarkable accomplishments. Some later traditions claimed she knew as many as 9 languages. Others suggested even more. The exact number matters less than the broader conclusion. She clearly possessed unusual linguistic talent. This ability transformed diplomacy. Imagine receiving foreign ambassadors. Instead of speaking through several translators, the queen addresses each visitor directly. The distance between ruler and guest immediately disappears. Conversations become more personal. Misunderstandings become less likely. Trust develops more naturally. Even today, world leaders who speak multiple languages often create stronger personal connections during international meetings. Cleopatra understood this more than 2,000 years ago. Modern historians also emphasize her understanding of symbolism. Throughout her reign, she carefully balanced multiple identities. To her Greek subjects, she remained a descendant of the Ptolemies. To Egyptians, she embraced traditional religious imagery associated with Isis. To Roman leaders, she presented herself as an equal sovereign rather than a dependent ruler. Each audience saw a version of Cleopatra designed to communicate legitimacy. Some people mistake this for inconsistency. Historians generally see something else: adaptability. Great leaders throughout history have often adjusted their public image according to circumstance while remaining true to larger political goals. Cleopatra appears to have mastered this art with remarkable sophistication. Her economic policies also deserve attention. Egypt's prosperity depended largely upon the Nile. Each annual flood determined agricultural success. Good harvests produced wealth. Poor floods created hardship. Managing grain supplies, therefore, became one of the government's most important responsibilities. Historical evidence suggests Cleopatra remained actively involved in administration during periods of famine and economic difficulty. She understood that stable government required more than ceremonies. It required practical solutions: taxation, trade, infrastructure, food distribution. These subjects rarely inspire romantic novels, yet they determine whether kingdoms survive. Modern archaeology has strengthened this picture. Excavations continue revealing evidence of Egypt's commercial connections with lands stretching far beyond the Mediterranean. Trade linked Egypt with Arabia, East Africa, India, and the wider Roman world. Goods flowed constantly through Alexandria's busy harbor. Maintaining these networks demanded careful administration. A poorly governed kingdom could not sustain such extensive international commerce. Again, Cleopatra's long reign suggests competence rather than mere good fortune.
Historians have also become increasingly interested in how Roman propaganda shaped her reputation.
During the 19th century, many researchers accepted Roman accounts almost without question. Today, scholars read those same texts more critically. They ask important questions. Who wrote this account? For whom? What political purpose might it have served? These questions do not reject ancient writers. Instead, they help us understand their perspectives. Octavian's supporters benefited enormously from portraying Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress. That image justified military action. It strengthened his own political position. Recognizing propaganda does not require dismissing every ancient source. Rather, it encourages balance. The truth often lies somewhere between admiration and hostility. One particularly interesting area of modern research concerns Cleopatra's appearance itself. Some scientists have attempted facial reconstructions based upon coins, sculptures, and surviving artistic representations. These efforts remain speculative. No reconstruction can claim complete certainty. Nevertheless, they consistently remind us that Cleopatra likely resembled a real human being rather than an impossibly perfect icon. She may have possessed features considered attractive by some and ordinary by others. Beauty has always varied across cultures and individuals. Even today, no single definition satisfies everyone. Perhaps Cleopatra herself understood this better than anyone. Rather than relying upon appearance, she developed qualities capable of influencing almost every person she encountered. Confidence, curiosity, education, conversation, emotional intelligence. These qualities age differently than physical beauty. Indeed, many grow stronger with experience. It is worth pausing for a moment to consider how unusual Cleopatra's life truly was. She ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth. She negotiated with Julius Caesar. She partnered with Antony. She became central to Rome's transformation from republic to empire. Very few individuals in history stood so close to events that reshaped entire civilizations. And she accomplished all this in a world overwhelmingly dominated by men. Modern historians increasingly recognize the significance of this achievement. They do not portray Cleopatra as flawless. No responsible historian would. She made political calculations that ultimately failed. She placed enormous trust in Antony. She underestimated Octavian's determination and political skill. Like every ruler, she made choices whose consequences she could not fully foresee. Yet mistakes do not erase accomplishments. They simply remind us that history is lived by human beings rather than legends. Imagine standing quietly upon Alexandria's harbor as dawn begins to break. The first rays of sunlight touch the calm sea. Fishing boats leave the shore. Merchants begin arranging goods in the marketplace. Priests prepare morning rituals. Somewhere in the royal palace, Cleopatra begins another day filled with decisions. She cannot know how history will remember her. She cannot imagine Shakespeare, or Renaissance painters, or Hollywood films. She knows only the challenges before her: protect Egypt, strengthen her kingdom, preserve independence, guide her people through uncertain times. Perhaps there is something deeply comforting in that thought. The people who make history rarely know they are making it. They simply do the best they can with the circumstances they inherit. Only later do others transform their lives into stories. Sometimes those stories illuminate the truth. Sometimes they obscure it. Our journey has gradually peeled away many of those later layers. Piece by piece, the real Cleopatra has begun emerging once again, not merely as a beautiful queen, but as a scholar, a linguist, a diplomat, a strategist, a monarch. A woman whose greatest power came from the remarkable mind she carried long after the first impression of her face had passed. And as we approach the final stages of our journey, one last question remains.
If the historical evidence has always pointed toward intelligence rather than unmatched beauty, why has the legend proven so much more difficult to forget? That answer tells us as much about ourselves as it does about Cleopatra. The night has grown wonderfully quiet. The gentle rhythm of the sea continues without hurry, touching the shores of Alexandria, just as it did more than 2,000 years ago. The stars above have changed very little since Cleopatra looked toward them, wondering what tomorrow might bring. History often feels distant.
Empires rise and disappear. Cities are rebuilt. Languages evolve. Generations come and go. Yet certain stories refuse to fade. They travel effortlessly across centuries, crossing borders, cultures, and civilizations. Cleopatra's story is one of them. By now, we have followed her journey from the royal palace of Alexandria to the writings of ancient historians, from carefully engraved coins to Renaissance paintings, from Shakespeare's stage to Hollywood's silver screen. Again and again, the historical evidence has quietly suggested something remarkable. Cleopatra became unforgettable not because ancient writers unanimously praised extraordinary physical beauty, but because they repeatedly described an extraordinary human presence. Yet despite this, millions of people still imagine her first and foremost as history's most beautiful queen. Why? The answer tells us something not only about Cleopatra, but about ourselves. Human beings have always loved simple explanations. The world is filled with complicated events. Wars begin for many reasons. Empires collapse through countless decisions. Leaders rise because of talent, luck, circumstance, preparation, and opportunity all working together. Reality is rarely simple. Stories, however, often are. When people searched for an explanation for Cleopatra's influence over Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, beauty became an easy answer. It required no lengthy political discussion, no examination of Roman history, no understanding of diplomacy or economics. It fit comfortably into a familiar pattern. A beautiful woman captures the attention of powerful men. The story feels complete. But history almost never rewards such simplicity. Imagine explaining the entire career of Julius Caesar by saying he was merely fortunate, or reducing Alexander the Great's achievements to physical strength alone, or claiming that Queen Elizabeth I ruled England successfully simply because she spoke well. Each statement contains a tiny fragment of truth, yet each misses the far greater picture. Cleopatra deserves the same careful attention. Reducing her life to beauty alone quietly erases everything else she accomplished. Perhaps another reason the legend survived lies within the nature of beauty itself. Beauty is universal. Every culture understands it. Every generation discusses it. It requires no specialized knowledge. Political strategy, on the other hand, demands patience to understand. Diplomacy rarely becomes the subject of popular entertainment. Economic reforms do not usually inspire blockbuster films. But beauty immediately captures imagination. Artists can paint it, poets can celebrate it, filmmakers can recreate it. The result is that beauty often becomes the easiest doorway through which audiences enter historical stories. unfortunately, many never continue beyond that doorway. There is also another, quieter truth. History has often remembered powerful women differently than powerful men. Across many centuries, ambitious male rulers were frequently described as determined, courageous, or visionary. Ambitious women were more likely to be described as manipulative or dangerously persuasive. Confidence became arrogance. Political intelligence became cunning. Diplomatic skill became seduction. This pattern appears again and again in historical writing, not only with Cleopatra but with many influential women throughout history. Modern historians increasingly recognize these patterns. They do not claim ancient writers deliberately invented everything. Rather, they acknowledge that every historian writes from within the values of their own society. Roman authors lived in a world where political power belonged overwhelmingly to men. An independent queen ruling one of the richest kingdoms in the Mediterranean naturally appeared unusual. Some admired her. Others viewed her with suspicion. Their descriptions inevitably reflected those attitudes. Understanding this helps us read their works more thoughtfully. It also reminds us that history is never merely a collection of facts. It is also a conversation between generations. Each age asks different questions. Each age notices different details. For centuries, readers asked whether Cleopatra was beautiful. Today, historians are more likely to ask why she became such an effective ruler despite overwhelming political challenges. The questions themselves have changed. That change has transformed our understanding of her life. Psychologists sometimes suggest that human memory naturally favors vivid images over complicated ideas. A single striking picture remains in the mind far longer than a detailed political argument. Perhaps that is why Cleopatra wearing a golden crown has become more famous than Cleopatra discussing taxation, diplomacy, or international trade. Images settle quickly into memory. Ideas require quiet reflection. And yet if we allow ourselves that reflection, an unexpected realization begins to emerge. The historical Cleopatra may actually be more inspiring than the legendary one. The legendary Cleopatra possesses impossible beauty. Few people can relate to that. The historical Cleopatra possessed determination, curiosity, education, resilience, courage, and remarkable communication skills. These qualities feel profoundly human. They remind us that influence often grows from lifelong learning rather than natural appearance. Knowledge can be acquired. Wisdom can deepen. Confidence can be developed. Empathy can be practiced. Languages can be learned. Diplomacy can be refined. These gifts belong not only to queens, but to anyone willing to cultivate them. Perhaps this explains why modern biographies of Cleopatra have become increasingly nuanced. Rather than asking whether she deserved the title of history's greatest beauty, scholars now explore how she governed, negotiated, learned, adapted, and survived within an extraordinarily dangerous political world. In doing so, they recover something precious that the legend almost concealed: her humanity. Imagine for a moment Cleopatra walking quietly through one of the gardens of her palace at the end of a long day. The evening breeze carries the fragrance of flowering plants. Somewhere nearby, water flows gently through stone fountains. The sounds of the city have softened into distant murmurs. For a brief moment before another meeting, another letter, another decision, she is simply a woman reflecting upon responsibilities that few people could ever fully understand. She cannot know that thousands of years later, people across the world will debate the shape of her nose. She cannot know that actresses will portray her before millions of viewers.
She cannot know that children in distant countries will learn her name in school. She knows only the weight of the present moment. Perhaps history becomes gentler when we remember that. The people we study were never trying to become legends. They were simply living, making decisions with incomplete information, hoping the future might judge them fairly. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. Our own understanding continues to evolve.
Every archaeological discovery, every careful translation, every thoughtful historian brings us a little closer to the woman behind the myth. Not because we wish to destroy the legend, but because truth itself possesses a quiet beauty that legends often overlook. And perhaps that is the greatest surprise of all. The closer we move toward the real Cleopatra, the more remarkable she becomes. Not because she was the most beautiful woman who ever lived, but because she proved that intellect, preparation, adaptabilities, and courage could shape history just as powerfully as armies. The sea outside Alexandria remains calm. The moon casts a silver path across the water. Somewhere beneath those waves lie the hidden remains of the palace where Cleopatra once planned, learned, negotiated, hoped, and dreamed. The stones are silent now, yet together they still whisper the same gentle lesson. Look beyond appearances. History almost always has a deeper story waiting to be discovered. And in our final journey, we will bring together everything we have learned, asking one last question. If Cleopatra herself could see the legend that has surrounded her for more than 2,000 years, what might she wish the world to remember instead? The lasting legacy of the real Cleopatra. Our journey is almost complete. The night has become wonderfully still, and the Mediterranean rests beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Somewhere beyond the darkness, gentle waves continue to touch the Egyptian coast with the same patient rhythm they have followed for thousands of years. Empires have disappeared. Languages have changed. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen. Yet the sea remains. Perhaps history is a little like that sea. Its surface is constantly changing, but beneath it lies a remarkable depth that only reveals itself to those willing to look carefully. Over the course of our journey, we have tried to do exactly that. We began with a simple question. Why wasn't Cleopatra famous for her beauty? At first, the question seemed almost impossible. After all, modern culture has spent centuries presenting Cleopatra as the most beautiful woman in history. Her face has appeared in paintings, sculptures, novels, operas, films, documentaries, advertisements, and countless works of imagination. For many people, beauty and Cleopatra have become almost inseparable. But as we slowly followed the surviving evidence, something unexpected happened. The legend became quieter. The woman became clearer. Again and again, the earliest voices directed our attention away from appearance and toward something much deeper. Plutarch did not describe an unmatched physical beauty. Instead, he described an unforgettable presence. He wrote of a voice that captivated listeners, of conversations that lingered in memory, of intelligence that drew people toward her. Other ancient writers, despite their different opinions, repeatedly emphasized similar qualities: education, confidence, political skill. Charm that emerged from personality rather than appearance alone. Even the surviving coins, imperfect though they may be, remind us that Cleopatra presented herself first and foremost as a ruler,
not as an ornament, not as an object of admiration, but as the sovereign of one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. Modern archaeology and historical research have continued this quiet conversation. Each new discovery encourages us to see Cleopatra as she truly lived, a multilingual queen, a gifted diplomat, a careful administrator, a student of philosophy and science,
a strategist navigating one of the most dangerous political landscapes of the ancient world. She ruled during a time when Rome was transforming itself from a republic into an empire. Few leaders inherited circumstances more difficult. Fewer still managed to preserve their independence for as long as she did. Of course, Cleopatra was not perfect. No ruler ever is. She made decisions that succeeded brilliantly. She made others that ended in tragedy. She trusted alliances that ultimately failed. She underestimated an opponent whose political patience proved extraordinary. History asks us to remember both triumphs and mistakes. Only then do we encounter real human beings instead of impossible legends. Perhaps this is why Cleopatra continues to fascinate us. She refuses to remain simple. Every time we believe we understand her completely, another layer quietly appears. She was Greek by ancestry, yet Queen of Egypt. She embraced Egyptian traditions while remaining deeply connected to Greek learning. She loved her country, yet depended upon Roman alliances. She possessed immense power, yet lived with constant uncertainty. She inspired admiration and fear in equal measure. She was both celebrated and condemned during her own lifetime. These contradictions do not weaken her story. They make it profoundly human. As we look back across more than 2,000 years, another realization begins to emerge. The question was never really whether Cleopatra was beautiful. Beauty itself has always been shaped by culture, fashion, and personal taste. What one generation admires, another may see differently. No universal standard has ever existed. No ancient writer left us a photograph. No description can settle the debate forever. Perhaps in the end, that debate matters far less than we once believed. The qualities that allowed Cleopatra to influence history were never limited to the face she presented to the world. They lived within her mind. Her ability to observe, to learn, to persuade, to adapt, to remain calm while circumstances shifted around her, to speak across cultures, to understand that words, when chosen carefully, often travel farther than armies. Those qualities do not disappear with time. They remain meaningful in every generation. There is something quietly comforting about that thought. The world often encourages us to notice appearances first. History gently reminds us to look again. Behind every famous face stands a life far richer than first impressions allow. Cleopatra's story invites us to practice that second look, to move beyond myth, to welcome complexity, to appreciate intelligence as much as beauty, wisdom as much as charm, character as much as image. Perhaps that is her greatest legacy. Not the legend that surrounded her, but the invitation to question legends themselves. To ask where stories come from, to wonder whose voices have survived and whose have been lost. To recognize that history is not merely a collection of dates and names. It is an endless conversation between evidence and imagination. Sometimes imagination creates magnificent works of art. Sometimes it hides remarkable truths. The task of history is never to destroy imagination.
It is simply to know the difference. Imagine one final time the city of Alexandria at dawn. The first light spreads gently across the harbor. The famous lighthouse catches the morning sun. Fishing boats drift quietly toward open water. Merchants begin arranging baskets of grain, fruit, and spices. Scholars unroll fresh scrolls inside shaded courtyards. Children laugh somewhere beyond the marketplace. Life begins again. Within the royal palace,
A queen prepares for another day of decisions. She reviews reports, greets ambassadors, discusses harvests, plans diplomacy, thinks about the future of her kingdom. She has no way of knowing that
more than 20 centuries later, people around the world will still speak her name. She cannot imagine the paintings, the plays, the films, the endless debates about her appearance. If she could somehow hear those conversations today,
perhaps she would smile gently before returning to her work. Not because appearance meant nothing. It surely mattered, as it has always mattered in every age, but because she understood something far more important. A kingdom cannot be governed by beauty alone.
an alliance cannot be negotiated by appearance alone. A civilization cannot be preserved by legend alone. Only wisdom, preparation, courage, and understanding possess that kind of lasting strength. And perhaps that is the quiet truth, waiting beneath the legend. Cleopatra was never remembered by those who truly knew her simply because she was beautiful. She was remembered because she was unforgettable, not for the perfection of her face, but for the extraordinary power of her mind. As the morning slowly arrives over the ancient shores of Egypt, the sea continues its endless rhythm, carrying echoes of forgotten voices across the centuries. Among them is the voice of a queen whose greatest achievement was not becoming the world's most famous beauty, but becoming one of history's most remarkable rulers. And perhaps after all this time, that is the memory most worthy of enduring. Thank you for joining this quiet journey through the life and legacy of Cleopatra. May her story continue to remind us that the most enduring influence is rarely found in outward appearance, but in the wisdom, character, and courage that shape the course of history long after every mirror has grown still.